My name is Juliano Fiori. I'm a PhD candidate at HCRI. I'm also head of studies on humanitarian affairs at Save the Children. I wanted to thank HCRI for the invitation to participate in this event today. And I'm very honored to be speaking with two colleagues and friends, Elena Fiddian-Qasmiyeh, who is Professor in Migration and Refugee Studies at UCL. She's also Director of UCL's Refuge in a Moving World Research Network and Co-Director of UCL's Migration Research Unit. And Patricia Daley, who is having a few difficulties logging in. I'm not sure, Jess, if she's yet with us. No, okay.
No, not just yet.
We're really hoping that she will be able to join us very shortly. But Patricia is a professor of the Human Geography of Africa at the University of Oxford. She's also vice principal and the Helen Morag Fellow in Geography at Jesus College, Oxford. Elena and Patricia have edited books together, including a Routledge collection on South-South cooperation. And Patricia has also contributed to a collection of book that I've recently edited with Bertrand Tate from HCRI that should be coming out in the next few months, which is on humanitarianism and liberal order. So Jess already said a few words about the format. The idea is that this is an informal conversation, really. We're not going to be doing any presentations. It's just an hour, and we'll try and stick to that. Although, as our friend Olivia Rutazibwe often reminds me, time is a colonial concept, and so I apologise already if we slip a little bit over. If people have questions while we're speaking, feel free to put up your hand. I think there is a function where you can put up your hand. I'm technologically inept, I'm afraid, so I'm not really sure where that is, but I'm told that there is a hand function, and if I see the hand goes up, or Elena or Patricia, if we see the hand go up, then we will invite you either to say your comment or ask your question with your video on and your mic on, or you can type questions in the chat, and we'll try and keep an eye on that so that we can keep it interactive. Jess, perhaps when Patricia does join, you can just give us a heads up, because there's lots of people here, so I can't see who's with us and who
yeah,
isn't.
no, I will do.
Yeah, I've just seen a comment already here in the chat. We'll write down the names of those books at the end of the session. So we're going to be discussing a number of things today. I suppose focus mostly on Eurocentrism in humanitarianism and forced migration studies and responses to forced migration, thinking about decoloniality, and I suppose the web's of conceptual history in a way. But we've got a few questions we'll run through, and maybe Elena, you can ask the first, you can pose the first one.
Great. Thank you, Juliano, and thanks again to HCRI for allowing us this space to have a conversation, as Juliano says, between friends and colleagues. So these are some questions that we've been exploring before, and my own research looks at Southern responses to displacement. But Juliano, you've written quite a lot about different facets of the history of humanitarianism. And one of the questions that you've been asking is why humanitarianism is seen as Western. So I was wondering if we could start with that question. Why is humanitarianism seen as Western, and how does your work engage with those questions?
Okay. Well, so I often use the term Western humanitarianism. And I certainly don't do that out of any sort of European chauvinism. But I also don't do it out of an extreme or nitpicking particularism. I suppose I see that term as offering a rejoinder to the perhaps quite fashionable tendency to try and explore what might be a universal ethic of humanitarianism. And I think that's very prevalent within humanitarian organizations, say aid agencies, in the last 10 years in particular, to try and understand different humanitarianisms in the plural. But I think the enthusiasm for global histories of humanitarianism have also contributed to that, and perhaps unwittingly at times, because often they aimed at complicating linear narratives of humanitarian history, institutional histories in particular, and deconstructing the universalism associated with liberal humanitarianism. But I suppose I take a sort of conceptual historical perspective on this, and I tried to, through genealogical work, I've tried to think about how humanitarianism as a concept has developed. And we can, Patricia's with us. Fantastic. Hello, Patricia. So rather than me continuing here, maybe I'll just say, Patricia, that we've just started. I've introduced you to everybody, and we're into the first question. Elena just asked me about why humanitarianism is seen as Western. Is humanitarianism a Western moral enterprise, let's say? So we can see already, if we look back to the sort of second half of the 18th century, there are uses of the word humanitarianism, humanitarian, in fact, more specifically humanitaire in French. If you look at the Diderot and D'Alembert encyclopedia, there is use of that word. Very interestingly, in fact, in the entry on neutrality, humanitaire appears, and that's from that's an entry from 1765, I think. But really, it was at the beginning of the 19th century, or in the first half of the 19th century, that the term started to be popularized, and it became increasingly associated with, I suppose, sentimental activities or a certain spirit in response to human suffering, but also with a move away from Christian theology towards what would be called what was called a religion of humanity, starting in France with Saint-Simon, and then with Auguste Comte. And this religion of humanity, this humanism, that was, I suppose, brought to Britain in some ways, or popularized in Britain most famously through John Stuart Mill, but through positivists in Britain, had quite a widespread influence on humanitarian language, let's say. And I think the term humanitarianism, as far as I've seen in my studies, became increasingly used retrospectively to discuss or to talk about activities in the past that were carried out in the name of helping a suffering humanity. But it was certainly associated with an ideal humanity in each person, and the idea of ever expanding circles of humanity. So moving away from group moralities associated with race and nationality and even class and gender, to a morality that would cover all of humanity. The interesting thing, though, I suppose, from the perspective of global histories, is how that was also linked to civilizational discourses, and how humanitarianism was often imagined as the end of a civilizational process. So it was a form of morality that was developed rationally at the end of an evolutionary process, a process of social development, and certainly biological theories of evolution became very prevalent in Western Europe and Britain, in particular in the second half of the 19th century, some with more eugenicist characteristics than others. But humanitarianism certainly bears this legacy as it comes into the 20th century and starts to develop different sorts of institutional affiliations. The reason why I think that's important is that, in fact, it's the term itself is very connected to an idea of the West. Auguste Comte, who I mentioned previously, and who is sort of pioneering thinker of the religion of humanity. He arguably is the person who really formulated the idea of Westernness, Occidentalité. The idea of the West as a socio-political bloc is very much associated with him. And so the idea of a certain kind of humanity becomes very linked to Westernness. And so sure, when we think today about humanitarianism, it's developed a slightly narrower definition to do with emergency response, often certainly response to situations of extreme urgency. But if we think about what the practices associated with humanitarianism are today and link them to other practices, sure, we can see that there's all sorts of different practices around the world that emerge from different cultural traditions, etc., that could be equated in some way. But my question is, why do we need to use this particular concept, which has become very popular over the last 20 to 30 years? In fact, aid workers themselves didn't really use the term humanitarianism very much in the 1970s, certainly British aid workers, let's say. When I've spoken to British aid workers who sort of developed their early careers in that period, they just said they were doing aid work back then. And so it's a term that's been more popularized in the last, let's say, 30 years. And so why is this the term that's most appropriate when we're thinking of cultures of altruism, of solidarity, of cooperation, of charity, of philanthropy, when it's a term that's so laden with colonial legacy? I know, Elena, you've done a lot of work on Southern responses to crisis, and I suppose Southern humanitarianisms as well. And so it'd be interesting to see what your perspective is, how practices of Southern response to suffering and crisis in the South maybe destabilize a notion of Western humanitarianism.
Absolutely, thanks, Juliano. So firstly, of course, it's important to recognise that the very concept of the South is itself problematic and contested in nature. So I've just posted there a piece which summarises Patricia and my introduction to the Handbook of South-South Relations, which Juliano referred to earlier, in which we discuss the many different ways in which the South has been conceptualised, framed, demarcated, etc. But one question that I've been using or that I've been exploring in my research is indeed this recognition that there are multiple forms of responding to displacement from across what we currently call the global South. So in my research project, Southern Responses to Displacement, we've been building on the research that I've done vis-a-vis the Caribbean and the Middle East, for example, and I'll come to that in just a moment, to look at how different actors from across the so-called global South have been responding to displacement from Syria. So in the broader research that I've been doing, I've been looking at the long history of so-called Southern humanitarianisms, or what I call South-South humanitarianism. One example being Cuba's response to displacement and to conflict-affected people since the 1950s. And my particular interest has been in looking at how the Cuban government has provided educational scholarships to Palestinian and Sahrawi refugees, amongst others, providing the foundations for self-sufficiency as those refugee graduates return to their refugee camp homes and lead their own infrastructures of assistance, of education, of social support. So that's one example of that broader history and of recognizing that there are actors outside of Europe, outside of the European and Western traditions, who have long been involved in providing responses, which may be framed as solidarity, for example, rather than necessarily being framed as acts of humanitarianism themselves. But the broader research, I've just posted a piece there looking at how refugees from Palestinian backgrounds, for example, refer to the Cuban responses that have been developed. So whether they consider Cuba's responses to be humanitarian or not, and who gets to actually determine whether a response is humanitarian, political, ideological, or based on frames of solidarity, for example. So we can look at it from that perspective. We can look at that broad history, and it certainly does not start in the 1950s. There are multiple humanitarianisms or multiple forms of response. So who gets to decide whether a response is humanitarian or not is something that I've been exploring. And for me, I'm particularly interested in how people who themselves are benefiting, in inverted commas, from different initiatives, whether it's the provision of direct aid or a Southern-led educational scholarship program, for example, how they themselves think about and refer to the humanitarian. But that's framed within the broader context of the policing of the humanitarian label, of the policing of humanitarian acts as well. And I'm sure that we'll come back to that in the broader discussion. So Cuba was one example. The research that I've been doing more recently, looking at responses to displacement from Syria, is also looking specifically at how refugees themselves respond to their own situations and the situations of other people who've been displaced. So what I refer to as refugee humanitarianism. Now that's a problematic concept because it is reifying the label of refugee, whereas people who've been displaced have multiple identities and may not identify themselves as refugees per se. So I'm reifying that term by using it not only once, but in fact twice, and also using that term humanitarian or humanitarianism, whereas people will often frame their actions as simply responding or acting in solidarity or drawing on their own faith traditions and justifications and motivations for response. So one of the examples that I often draw on in these conversations is examples of Palestinian refugees in Badawi refugee camp in North Lebanon, collecting resources, financial through zakat, for example, but also material resources from other refugees who work together to cook meals, which are then distributed in food baskets by people who themselves have displacement backgrounds to other people who've been displaced. So that's another example of what we could frame as refugee humanitarianism, or as an example of a Southern-led response. So then that question arises, well, why would we use the term humanitarian? Are there other frames of reference which might actually be more helpful? So in my research with reference to the Cuban program, for example, a lot of my interlocutors, these are extracts from interviews with Palestinian refugees who studied in Cuba, used what we could call humanitarian qualifiers. So they described the Cuban education program as having a humanitarian component, in the words of Marwan, a humanitarian dimension in Eunice's perspective, a humanitarian aspect or humanitarian ingredients, whereas other people referred to the Cuban education program as a mainly humanitarian system which carries humanitarian elements, Hamdi's term, and shares its humanitarian message in spite of the embargo against Cuba. And in doing this, they also often framed it, or framed this humanitarian aspect in relation to ideological motivations. So, for example, Muhammad argued that the humanitarian aspect outweighs the ideological one, emphasizing, I quote, the program's strong humanitarian aspect. And Ahmed and Nimr declared that the Cuban scholarships were offered without conditions or conditionalities and without blackmailing Palestinians to educate them. So those references for me are very interesting for many different reasons, including because they seem to position the Cuban response as a contrast to the neoliberal humanitarian programming, which often is framed around the broader ideological and political frameworks of conditionalities, of requiring beneficiaries to perform in a particular manner, thereby disrupting this assumption that Western humanitarianism is necessarily humanitarian in and of itself, recognizing that humanitarian initiatives are deeply implicated within frameworks of political requirements, of ideological aims, and indeed the neo-colonial enterprise, which has been so well documented by critical scholars. So we can ask all of those questions around responses from the South, but there are also different entry points to these questions. And I'll turn now to ask Patricia, for example, how, if I've been documenting, for example, the histories of different forms of response by actors from the South and the current processes by which refugees themselves respond to their own needs and those of others, or Cuba or Malaysia or Brazil, which have variously been positioned as actors from the South. That's what I've been looking at. How has your research been engaging with these questions, Patricia, with reference to responses from the South?
Thank you, Elena and Juliano, for really, your very informed comments on this topic. I'm going to start off by disagreeing with Juliano. I thought we were supposed to be having a discussion. So your introduction about the origins of humanitarianism, I found might be correct, but it's very problematic as far as people from the global south are concerned. As you probably well know, the development of sort of ideas about the universal morality or universal man, the interventions of philosophers like Immanuel Kant and so on, actually ignored or saw Europeans as being superior, as the man being superior to non-white. So it's really difficult to say that this morality was being extended globally. It was very confined to the Europeans and predominantly to the European man. And this is the whole unpacking of the man in Western liberal discourse has been done by Sylvia Winter, Jamaican scholar. And I think that's really important to note, because when we talk about, the 18th century, 19th century, don't forget enslavement, oppression, colonization was all taking place, and people were being displaced, dispossessed, eliminated, and so on. And that was acceptable because they were not seen as human, right? So the concept of what constitutes the human, who is the human around that time, was still being debated. And that's why it links, as you say, to the ideas about evolution. Because of course, if you're not seen as being fully developed, fully human, you don't have those moral rights. And those ideas informed, the Christian intervention, for example, in the global south. The whole movement might have framed itself as humanitarian, which it still does, but it's about converting or bringing people to a so-called higher morality, irrespective of what their religious practices were. There was no recognition that they had such practices. They were closer to being animals than humans. So I think that civilizational discourse that was associated with humanitarianism actually, discounted any such acts as taking place between peoples and communities within the global south. So I think we need to really go back and unpack that history and look at it within the context of how Europeans were, were operating in other parts of the world at the time. I think the other issue, so humanity then was a bounded concept up until the Second World War, well, up until the 60s. But even when the concept of, debates around Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I mean, don't forget, the majority of, certainly the place where I study, Africa, people were, were still under colonialism, and some real atrocities took place in Kenya during the Mau Mau period in the 1950s, okay, committed by the British. So the idea of, again, there were lots of efforts to prevent knowledge, or debates going on or discussions about what was happening in certain countries in the global south, because they would have challenged the Western view that they had a superior morality. And if I haven't made structured notes, so I'll just say a few more things and stop. And but the issue about international humanitarian law, I mean, I work on refugees, and if you look at why these ideas about Western superiority continue at an epistemic level as well as a practical level in terms of policy. At the epistemic level, it's Westerners who decide, by and large, what the discourse should be around, or what the policy should be around interventions and what constitutes humanitarianism. The bulk of the scholarship on this is still done in Western institutions, and that's why that's why it's partly problematic, because they universalize, and in fact, that universalization is done, in order not to address, right, something that's really central to unpacking Western humanitarianism and the way it's operated in recent years, and that is racism. And if we are going to move forward, we have to have an anti-racist humanitarianism. Right? It's got, humanitarian actors have to address racism at its center in order to be able to move forward, because of its history and because of how it maps out in terms of the power dynamics, epistemic power dynamics, on the ground and in policy making rooms. So I looked at the OAU, you know, what's been happening in Africa with respect to refugee legislation, and the OAU. If you look at the OAU charter, you know, it was the Organization of African Unity, of course, before it became the African Union. It's 1969 Convention on Refugees. It was very much the 1967 Protocol of the UN. They changed it, they tweaked it to address the so-called specific character of the situation in Africa. But it was very, you know, I'm sure the people who wrote it were the same. Okay? And I'm going to say an aside. I'm going to say something. I knew, you know, a really lovely English man who, you know, is a property lawyer or land law. He used to write land law. And he went around in the 1990s, brought in by donors, and I think wrote the land laws for, they were revising, there was a donor push to revise land laws. And he wrote the land laws for about 6 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa 1 year. And of course he said he consulted, but this is, and you know, of course people were protesting in Tanzania. I know they were protesting. And I think he did some also in the Middle East. Unfortunately, he died in the Middle East not so long ago on a consultancy. But that's what happens with these laws. You get a group of consultants from the West who go around and write them, and they use the same framework irrespective. So, and even, you know, coming up to more recent times, I think African governments, even in the 1960s, in 1963, the African Union actually set up the OAU Liberation Committee. And its focus was on decolonizing Africa and African liberation from colonial rule. And it was quite a progressive committee, but it didn't get widespread support even in the OAU. Partly, I mean, they went along with it because it was being driven by Julius Nyerere, then president of Tanzania. And the OAU Liberation Committee was based in Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, but it had very progressive policies, not just on the liberation of Africans, but also providing aid to liberation movements. It provided education. So South African, Namibian, Zimbabwean refugees could actually be put in universities across the African continent. So it's actually, you know, the capacity there for real progressive action existed. But that has declined as African governments have pushed over and over again to conform to international laws or to international policy frameworks around the movement of refugees, whether it's the EU or the IOM. I'll stop there. Sorry, I'm going on for too long.
Juliano, I'm sure that you want to come in there. I'm just going to flag that we have a question from Magella Williams, which we'll come back to after Juliano's response. So I'll read out your question then after Juliano's spoken, I think.
Thanks a lot, Elena. Yeah, so thanks, Patricia. I appreciate the pushback, and I don't want to too readily resolve or too easily resolve that conflict. In fact, maybe I wasn't clear enough, so I apologize for that. I certainly wasn't coming from the perspective of some sort of moral exceptionalism or trying to project some Eurocentric idea of humanity. In fact, I was trying to do quite the opposite. I was trying to say that it's exactly the conceit at the heart of the European idea of humanity that makes it problematic for us to try and universalize that and say that humanitarianism in other places is something that grows endogenously. Understood as humanitarianism. I'm not saying that there aren't practices of solidarity that should be studied and should be recognized, but I think that they shouldn't be bunched under that category for exactly the reason that conceit, that Eurocentric conceit, should be associated with the very colonial and civilizational characteristics that developed particularly in the 19th century. And so my position is one that seeks to challenge the civilizational discourse, not to accept it and accept its sort of liberal, cosmopolitan and universalizing tendencies. At the same time, I think it's worth recognizing, and this is something that you've pointed out in the past, Patricia, that those European conceits weren't actually always that European. They were often based on influences that came from outside of Europe, and that were either hidden behind the erudite philosophies of Enlightenment Europeans, or were just marginalized for other reasons. But particularly ideas from the Arab Enlightenment, which preceded the European Enlightenment. There's many interesting texts. We can put a couple actually in the chat afterwards that would be of relevance in this regard. But in fact, maybe this takes us nicely onto Magella's question. So Elena, if you want to ask that.
Yeah, thanks, Juliano. Thanks, Patricia. So we have framed this around a conversation. So it's fantastic to have questions from you as well. So please do post those in the chat bar. So Magella has asked, Patricia, how do you suggest that institutionalized racism in humanitarianism should be addressed? Has this been explored properly? And if so, where? So I think that also comes back to a question that we were hoping to discuss, which is precisely with reference to decolonization and how we can link anti-colonial practices and from that anti-racist practices within the broader framework of humanitarianism, bearing in mind that humanitarianism itself is this multiple reality rather than a fixed, static, institutionalized box, as it were. So Patricia, over to you on that question. Patricia, you might be muted.
Okay. Yeah, can I just pick up quickly on what Juliana says about learning from others, and then I'll try to answer that question, which is a very tough one. And I think we should also learn. I mean, one of the things that obviously Europeans have not articulated sufficiently or looked into sufficiently is, for example, the Haitian Revolution, right? Which was about universal the equality of everyone, probably man at the time, but still, it was about that was its goal, and yet it was often discounted because it was carried out by non-white by black people. Right? So there's a lot to learn there. In terms of institutional problems, I mean, I think the humanitarian, and I might upset a few people by saying this, I think humanitarianism and the way it operates at the moment institutionally is an industry, right? And it's a very profitable, a very lucrative industry. And it's very difficult for people who are enterprise, who are, making, let's say, who are making a profit or doing very well, to actually interrogate themselves and to look at what they're doing wrong. Obviously, if the business, I'm not a business person, I'm just talking off the top of my head, but I suspect that if a business starts to fail, or there are problems, or comes under attack, or is challenged, then they will look and interrogate, and there might be some introspection to see where we've gone wrong, what can we do. And I think there have been occasions in recent years, there have been a lot, I mean, if you think about it, after the Rwandan genocide in 1994, when there was really a Wild West situation going on in Eastern Congo, where, I don't know, over 200 or more refugees, and there was a view that some of the people died needlessly, and they died because of humanitarian intervention and would have been better off without. And they also died because of some of the sophisticatedness of the humanitarian intervention, when all they needed was just basic rehydration packages and so on. And I think there was some, sort of thinking that went on after that within the amongst humanitarian organizations to try to avoid similar situations, right? And so but obviously, even though I think people like myself were really even more critical and saying, actually, we need to look at issues around race that hasn't figured. Right. So, I mean, and institutions are really good at reproducing themselves, right? So, yeah, they will do. I think the pressure, though, has to be great, and it has to come from externally in order for them to actually make any significant changes. And that's why, and I think the Black Lives Matter movement now has put pressure on international organizations to actually, really take a close look at their activities, the policies, their activities, but they're also dependent, a lot of them are dependent on funding from Western governments or, large institutions who themselves are not willing to take, to do the sort of work that's necessary that we would see as decolonial. So I'm not really, I think because I'm based in the West, and because I am close to these institutions, I think I will continue to approach them with a very critical outlook. And I think they need to engage really in some anti-racist practices. And it's relatively easy for people to say, I'm not racist. I've seen so many liberal scholars and even feminists claim they're not racist, white feminists, because they support equality. And then once you get close, you realize, I was wrong. This, race, these ideas about equality only go so far, and certainly not going to. They're not going to matter when it comes down to my pocket and my income and so on. So I'm, I really am champion instead Global South institutions and actors to come up and to put pressure and to devise their own ways of addressing some of the challenges that they face, particularly challenges that we might, put under the humanitarian umbrella. I think that's the way forward.
Thanks, Patricia. Maybe on a similar theme, as you mentioned, in fact, the impact of Black Lives Matter on the aid sector. I've certainly seen that at Save the Children, the way that not just colleagues, but I suppose executive leadership have responded to external pressures to address institutional inequalities and the different approaches that have been taken to doing that. There's been a lot of talk about decolonizing aid recently, but Elena, I know you've done a lot of work on decoloniality, looking at decolonial perspectives, particularly on forced migration, but also how those link to the so-called localization agenda. And so maybe you could discuss a bit of your work in that area.
Thanks, Juliano. I'm going to try and pick up on some of the points that have been raised as well in the chat bar as we go along. So with reference to the localization of aid agenda, obviously this is an international commitment to increasing funding towards so-called local actors, where local effectively equals global south. So states from the global south, communities, but primarily states and municipalities, etc., in the global south. So there is an ostensible official commitment to supporting responses from the South. And yet one of the key critiques that arises with reference to that attempt to incorporate the understanding and knowledge of states which are often neighbouring to conflict-affected countries, etc., is that those responses are co-opted into the neoliberal framework, into the modes of response which are funded by and led by the priorities of states from the global north. So one of the questions that arises is, well, how does one go beyond that co-optation? But another question that arises is also, well, how do we still go beyond the assumption that Western humanitarianism continues to be the system? How do we really actually recognize meaningfully that there are multiple forms of response taking place in multiple directions simultaneously? And we need to critique Western-led humanitarian responses, absolutely. But in so doing, we can't continue to reify that as the humanitarian model in the singular. And I think that's one of the dangers of these debates, is that we actually can't constantly come back to the North as the marker, as the frame of reference. And then we need to discover different ways of engaging with that plurality, with that multiplicity of forms of response in a way that doesn't continue to reify the North as the norm and as the standard, which needs to be be somehow modified in order to fit the recognition that there is this plurality? How do we actually go back and start from the assumption from the very beginning that there is this plurality, and that that plurality of responses is situated within unequal power relations, with unequal histories, with histories which are deeply embedded in violence and oppression, and yet which have developed in their own trajectories with their own forms of knowledge, not just forms of practice? So I think that partly comes maybe to the question that Adele was asking in terms of how you go beyond Western thinking and how you incorporate understanding and knowledge from oppressed nations, communities into evolving practice. That was Adele's question. And I think that understanding and knowledge is at the forefront. So part of what my project has been doing has been looking at how people respond, how institutions respond. But I think we need to go beyond that recognition of how people and states have responded and what Southern humanitarianisms look like, to interrogate those structural inequalities more deeply, and to raise those questions around the politics of knowledge production and how that is positioned within these unequal frames and structures. Another question that we have here from Simon Turner, thanks for your question, which isn't at all off topic, Simon. The question is with reference to South-South everyday humanitarianism, as Simon has framed it, recognizing that such responses are often couched in religious and moral terms. So absolutely, faith-based responses, whether religious, kind of formal, institutionalized religious frameworks, or everyday forms of religiosity and spirituality, form the foundations of many responses, including those that we've been documenting in the context of the Middle East. But again, we go back to that question. We can add that empirical evidence. We can add that acknowledgement that there are faith-based responses or local responses or Southern responses. But then the question continues to be, then what? How do we actually implement that into a decolonial anti-racist process, which returns us to that plurality rather than reifying the West as continuing to be the standard and the norm? I can't reconcile that. It's the question that continues to be the focus of so many different scholars' attention. And I am certainly not the best positioned person to delineate that, precisely because, as Patricia has said, these are debates and conversations that are taking place amongst people who've been displaced, within the communities of refugees, IDPs, host communities, within the municipalities, the towns, the cities where people are living, not just the preserve of Western knowledge and Western thinking. And that's precisely where there needs to be a relocation of the debates and a relocation of the conceptualizations which form the foundations of those debates, building on the long-standing literature in so many different languages precisely on these questions and on these issues. I'm going to hand over to whether it's Juliano or Patricia who'd like to come in there, and I think that we've got lots of questions in the chat bar which we're not going to be able to come back to in their entirety, but I'll hand over to Juliano in the first instance, and then I'm sure Patricia would like to come back to.
Patricia, would you like to come back on something Elena said there?
No, probably, yeah, about religion. And I think one of the, I'm not opposed to religious, obviously faith-based humanity, solidarity or interventions or whatever. It's when that comes with civilizational discourse. And a lot of evangelical interventions in Africa, I'm afraid, are attached with that discourse, associated with that discourse. And they're also depoliticized. And someone in the chat talked about, how do we decolonize, I think it was a question, decolonize humanitarianism without depoliticizing it? And I mentioned Rwanda, and the reason why one of the critics of humanitarianism during the Rwandan genocide was that all these development experts and humanitarian actors were there in Rwanda as well, before the genocide, and all signs were that this genocide was taking place, and there were, nobody said anything because their projects were going really well. Right? So it's really, yeah. So I'm just thinking about my own community, Black community in London at the moment during the COVID pandemic, and how really helpful the Black churches have been to the communities in terms of supporting them, both on Zoom and providing material support as well. So You know, my argument would be, and you know, Juliano is in South America, but I think we need. You might want to say something about this, but I think we want a theology that's liberational in many parts of the global South. I'm not opposed to if people want to have beliefs in whatever, but it's got to be one that you know, addresses much wider social concerns.
Thanks, Patricia. I probably won't come back on liberational theology, partly because there's sort of too many family connections, and it would be a sort of Freudian attack of mine. But I would like to come back at something, challenge something that Elena mentioned about reification of the West and Western humanitarianism. I say again, I think my point, the point I'm trying to make about Western humanitarianism is an anti-colonial one, but it's also an anti-capitalist one. It's about embedding humanitarianism not just as a set of practices in response to emergency, but to try and understand the conceptual and the philosophical baggage that term brings with it. And so it's only centering the West if we're actually centering humanitarianism. And if we're centering those particular practices that we associate with humanitarianism that have their political history, obviously not only in the last 40 or 50 years, that stretches back at least a couple of centuries. But if we think about practices of cooperation, as I've been saying, responses to disaster and to conflict, to emergency, that as being at the center of what we're discussing, and the politics associated with that, we're actually able to try and to isolate the particular politics that has been associated with liberal humanitarianism in particular of the West, and try to understand what it is that's projecting or promoting historically, in historical terms. What ideas about the individual that's bringing to us, which aren't necessarily the same ideas as you said, Elena, when that are most prominent when you study South-South cooperation, refugee cooperation. Your work on Cuba would be extremely relevant in this regard. And so if we're centering humanitarianism, what we're doing then is, as a concept, what we're doing is, I feel, is playing into the institutional histories, the conventional institutional histories, in which we see the Red Cross at the very center, and others are just sort of spreading out or flowing out of that history, or the things that we discovered belatedly that might have occurred in the past. And so what I'm saying, and it might be a slightly controversial one for somebody who represents Save the Children, is that you can't really delink humanitarianism from the colonial. And so I'm all for aid agencies trying to go about decolonizing their work in different ways. I'm still actually, and I've been hosting conversations with, in fact, you've participated in one, Elena, on this topic at Save the Children. I'm still not sure what decolonizing aid really means in the aid sector. I think it's good that people are trying to think through that. But aid agencies can't be at the forefront of processes of decolonization. Let's face it, their histories are so imbued with colonial baggage that you can't expect that aid agencies, or they shouldn't be. Let's say it, they shouldn't be at the forefront of anti-colonial struggle. In fact, the echoes of anti-colonial struggle are still very, very strong within Save the Children. If we look back at the 1931 Conference on the African Child that Save the Children organized, an African-American journalist called James Ford got up on stage exactly to condemn the Eurocentric conceit about humanity and an expanding humanity that would cover Africa eventually, once Africa is sufficiently developed. And he said, look, here you are with this moralistic discourse, and yet you've got all these colonial connections to colonial administrators who are still active today. And he was dragged off stage. And so now we hear executive leaders talking about decolonizing aid, and sure, that's great. And there will inevitably be a co-option that's involved in that process, because they're big institutions, as Patricia says, they're part of an industry. So I suppose that's to some extent responds to James Smith's question. I get which, so I'm trying to scan up here. James says, have you seen examples of more meaningful decolonizing practices amongst the established Western NGOs, the SAVES, MSFs, IRCs, etc.? I mean, the only way that I feel that these organizations can meaningfully engage in anti-colonial practice is by thinking about how they function from the inside outwards. In other words, how they engage in the public sphere, how they try to align themselves with the politics that is anti-colonial, with the people, with the activists, the movements that are at the forefront of anti-colonial struggle. It's not by decolonizing your operation, it's not by decolonizing your mind that you're going to change. Those things are useful, but they're insufficient.
Absolutely. I'm just going to come. Can I come back there, Juliano, and just say that absolutely this recognition that if you focus on the humanitarian, which is a label, an epithet that has been so heavily guarded, policed, and the club has been protected as in who can belong or not. If we continue to focus on the humanitarian, then there is that interlinking or that circular linking back to the West as if they are equivalent, in spite of, as Patricia has said, that long-standing history, which actually demonstrates that that history was itself co-opted from peoples from across what we currently know as the global South. So one way of going beyond that is to expand the discussion beyond humanitarianism to look more broadly at responses, whether it's solidarity based, whether it's based on mutual aid, whether it's based on political struggles for social justice, and how we can expand that conversation and place humanitarianism as it's currently understood within that Western frame as part of that broader puzzle of different responses, which are all deeply implicated in and embedded in different power structures and in different powers which are struggling with one another to achieve different aims. So I think that that's part of the reason why the project that I'm currently leading was originally titled Analysing South-South Humanitarianism, towards actually looking at Southern-led responses. So even trying to go beyond that notion of the South as a bounded geographical or geopolitical entity as well. So what is it to think through the South? What is it to think about Southern approaches to, rather than people in the South, for example, as being the only actors which could be considered? So if we expand that to look at different responses and we place the Western framework as part of that broader puzzle, then that's one way of going beyond that. But we come back to the question that you've raised, Juliano, and you have raised as well, Patricia, and so many of you in the chat have discussed, which is, well, how do we go about addressing the structural barriers which prevent certain people, certain forms of knowledge, certain forms of responses from being implemented, from being supported? And how do we challenge those power structures that prevent people from finding and acting upon the solutions to their problems and the problems of the people who live alongside them? How do we address those structural inequalities which are deeply embedded in the capitalist system, in neocolonial or frankly colonial occupation, oppression, violence, etc.? And those are very, very important questions which destabilize, which require a deep shaking of the status quo. And of course, institutions which are part of that broader industry, which receive private funding from corporate corporations, as many of you have commented in the chat, etc. Those institutions do not like the unsettling of the status quo, because what they want is the perpetuation of the self. They don't want an acknowledgement of that diversity and that plurality and the recognition that they are part and parcel of those unequal systems of violence, whether it's physical violence, whether it's epistemic violence, as Patricia has indicated earlier, etc. We have 3 minutes left. Juliano and Patricia, we promised ourselves that we were going to end on a note which wasn't all doom and gloom, and that we weren't going to depress all of the audience members. So I'm going to hand over to Juliano and Patricia to ensure that we end on a more constructive note. So over to you.
Do you want me to start? Okay. Can I just say, I think, for a long time, the idea of community was associated with, socialism and communism, and in some countries they're still using that to be people who talk about the need for communal solutions. And I think we've got to the point now when we recognize that in many countries in the global South, there have been traditions that focus on community well-being There are concepts in Africa. I mean, Ubuntu is used a lot, but there are lots of other ways of, living together in a convivial way. And I think we need to perhaps pay more attention to those. And I think that's the way forward, actually.
Yeah, and I'd agree. I don't really want to have the last word here. So I think I just agree with what Patricia says, at the risk of sounding too consensual after quite a nice debate that we've had. I'd say an important point here is about not just decentering the West, but decentering humanitarianism itself, and with doing so without reifying the term or the concept. I think that's probably what I take away from this conversation. But also, I know this is a careers day, and so there's many people who are interested in getting involved in humanitarian work in different ways. As I discussed with colleagues of mine at Save the Children, I think it's one thing to work for a humanitarian organization and to feel like you're participating, contributing to its work. The other is to think that is the definition of your entire being, and that you're then no longer also a citizen, a political agent, and that you can't also engage critically with that world. And so I think that's the thing maybe to take away. The positive note is that if people want to work in the humanitarian sector, that they can also engage critically with what it's about, what its history is, what it's promoting, what its politics, various politics might be. And so on that note, I'll thank colleagues Elena and Patricia, and I'll pass back to Jess maybe just to close up. And thanks a lot to Jess and to HCRI and everybody else who's participated to the questions. Sorry we didn't get through them all.
Thanks to everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much to our guest speakers. I feel like that conversation could have lasted another few hours. It was really interesting. Just for the benefit of our attendees, we've recorded all the resources that were mentioned, so we will be sending them around afterwards, and also a recording of the session. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.